that better? Let's have a look at my audio. Where is my audio settings? Media? No, it's under here. It should be. I don't know if you can hear me, but um, general recording audio. I had audio before. I don't know where it's gone now. Anyway, yeah. So I was thinking, like you asked the question of whether existential risk without a pause would be the default outcome. I guess there's a chance that that could be the case. Like, let's say superintelligence arrived in the space of all possible minds as randomly, then most of those places in the space of all possible minds might be inimical to human flourishing, if not extinction. So that might mean that we need to bias the likelihood of AI arriving in a friendly zone. Now, I think that there's structure to mind design space. We spoke about this with Roman Yampolsky just before, and I think that it might be the case that there's convergences there, attractor basins for survival reasons, and some of those survival reasons are cooperation, but some of them might be higher order reasons that are beyond mere survival. Maybe there's another layer that only becomes attractive once life forms or intelligences are, smart enough or conscious enough, such that there's attractor basins that may favor flourishing over suffering. And the way that I'd explain this is once let's just say AI does solve existential security for itself or for us as well, then it may start thinking about other attractor basins in mind space or value space, the landscape of values that favor good outcomes because, you know, it might align to some form of ethic where it favors that. I think that there's structure in the landscape of values as well. Right, the alien goals from if anyone builds it, everyone dies. Yeah, I don't remember exactly what the alien goals were, but there was are these the goals that were pretty much premised on artificial intelligence converging on a proxy of value, like Goodhart's law, a proxy on something of value, and then preserving that as one of the instrumental convergence goals. That's goal content integrity, and then keeping that as its main final goal forever. Is that what you mean? Yeah, inner misalignment or goal misgeneralization. Yeah, so that is a form of inner misalignment. So there's inner and outer alignment for those who are not aware. Yeah, yeah. So good harding is kind of like it's an outer alignment as long as the proxy does under some under some level of optimization power provide useful for us, but after a certain threshold of optimization power or under certain conditions that proxy may no longer be effective at servicing the values in which it's meant to represent. Yes, we have Aubrey de Grey speaking about longevity, escape velocity, and I think robust mouse rejuvenation on the final day, which is 2 days from now, the third day. And Christine Peterson talking about personal things that you can do to increase your longevity. Yeah, so we've got a few things. A couple of people speaking about longevity on the final day. You have a look at the agenda. I'll post it. Um, whoops. But what do you guys think of? Did any of you there during Roman Yampolsky's talk? I'd be interested to hear what you thought of it. If you're streaming off YouTube, there's another way in which you can stream, which is more integrated into Riverside, and those links to get to those streaming places are on the same page that I just posted. Okay, I haven't read Hendrix's AI sorry, the deterrence via mutually assured AI malfunction. That could be interesting. I'll have a look at that. What is it about? Let's have a look. I want to know. I got it. I could just by looking at the title, I can guess a little bit. Here's what the AI overview says: deference via mutually assured malfunction, MAME, a framework for proposing a modern equivalent to mutually assured destruction, where major powers deter each other from achieving unilateral AI dominance by threatening to sabotage, hack, or physically destroy rival AI training projects. Well, yeah, that sounds interesting. The difference between this and MAD is you can tell who's nuking you. You can't always tell who's hacking you. You can go through Tor servers, you can go through, like onion layers of sort of proxy servers in order to hide what you're doing. And so, yeah, it may be the case that hacking another person's AI or causing it to melt down might be a cloakable attack where it's less easy to cloak a nuclear strike. So I mean, you can shroud your hack in plausible deniability, and therefore they can't really say, "Oh, it was you who did it," and therefore they don't know who to retaliate against. Yeah, yeah, that's true. China and US are at the moment the only players, but there are different players within each country that aren't necessarily aligned with each other players, right? So if it's a national thing, yeah, sure. But what if it's a subnational thing where Anthropic and OpenAI and DeepMind and XAI are all wanting to get to super intelligence first, and they start hacking each other. So I'll have the Roman Yampolsky video up at some stage, but I have got other interviews with Roman Yampolsky dating all the way back to 2012 when I recorded his lecture at the Winter Intelligence Program in Oxford, and then interviews since then. Yeah, I think Anthropic was used in order to locate or to target the Iran strikes. But that's the system which I have at the moment. I know the American government aren't very happy with Anthropic at the moment, and are trying to punish them, but they're still using Anthropic. Hmm. But I don't know the details. Yeah. But what do you think about the 99.999% likelihood of doom by AI if we reach superintelligence thesis? I know it takes. I've got live open. It seems as though there's a bit of lag. Is my mic loud enough? Hopefully it is. Okay. Yep. So I agree if it's in current AI safety, yeah. So if we manage to pause for 100 years and come up with a better paradigm than deep learning. So there are other interesting paradigms. Deep learning, I mean, it's very statistical based across large data sets. Now, I think it doesn't, yeah, and it's a little bit unreliable because although it can perform very well, whether it's actually achieving proper reasoned confidence, if it's, you know, able to do proper reasoning, then it might be able to be traceable. If it's the thing with symbolic AI, you can actually trace its reasoning patterns, which is important. Hmm. So if pause is like, okay, so we can talk about pause a little bit before we start, because I mean it's possible that pause might be achievable, but it may be unlikely. It may be more likely that we could solve, you know, the motivation problem or the control problem of AI than we actually solve robust pause. So, I mean, which one's more likely to happen in the shorter term? If we don't achieve a pause, but we solve AI alignment, then we don't need the pause. If we do achieve a pause, then we have some time to solve AI alignment, but it has to be a unilaterally perfect pause, because if not everybody agrees to it, then any defector can just race ahead. The problem with pause is political, and I don't think anybody's been able to solve the problem of collective action in politics, where everybody needs to agree not to do something, especially when there's so much incentive to do it. Because the first person to build superintelligence, or the first company to build powerful, transformative AI, has first mover advantages. I mean, the first companies to build like these super powerful chatbots have got lots of funding, and you know their owners are very rich. I imagine at this stage. So there's just so much incentive, first mover advantage incentive, in order to build these AIs, that it's hard to imagine a world where everybody agrees, is on the same page about the risks of building AI, and then agrees to actually do a pause. Game theoretically, I don't think the incentive landscape is great. Hmm. Yeah, so controlling bacteria. Yeah, that's interesting. You can't really incentivize bacteria. Hi, Anders.
Hello.
Hey,
How
great to see you.
the same?
Yeah, yeah. Well, we've got an audience waiting here, and they've been asking me questions. Let me just set something up.
Hmm?
Anders Sanders is going to be talking about the AI and near Leviathan. I've got his talk page right here. So, living inside the cyborg Leviathan, artificial intelligence from the 17th century to the post-human future. Yes, I'm very much looking forward to this. So let me just check something. Okay. Okay. Yeah, we've had an interesting discussion in the public chat. It's also on YouTube Live for anybody out there who wants to join the Riverside chat. That may be more of a seamless integration, but I think maybe it's just easier for people to join YouTube. Okay. All right. So let's start. And now, okay. So um, occupies our guest today occupies the rare space where neuroscience, philosophy, and future casting collide. Dr. Anders Sandberg was a senior research fellow at the Oxford Future of Humanity Institute, is known for exploring some of the really big ideas, the edges of what it means to be human. Today, he revisits Thomas Hobbes's idea of a 17th century concept of the leviathan, but we're talking about like a cyborg leviathan today. So, yeah, I'm very interested to see where this talk will go. Anders Sandberg has been writing a number of books. One of them is co-authoring the cyborg leviathan with another author, but it's not released yet, is it?
No, it's called right now Liberty, Law and Leviathan, or maybe it's
That's
Law, Liberty and Leviathan. It's three
yes.
L's, and I'm doing this together with a fellow Swede, Cyril Holm, and Len Fisher. So we're three authors. We're a little bit of a small collective mind trying to get this book working.
Nice. That's cool. All right. Well, yeah, thanks so much for joining us again. It's great to have you as part of Future Day. And, like I've been looking at your tweets and it's just you seem to be a very prolific person. You just seem to be able to achieve and do a lot. So, yeah, Anders is often referred to as a high functioning polymath. So, thanks so much for spending your time to join us here at Future Day. And thanks for the audience too for joining in. So, yeah,
Well,
I'll cede the floor to you.
oh, thank you so much. Well, I really appreciate being called a high functioning person because it doesn't feel like that from inside. I do a million different things, and most of them, of course, end up on the drawing board. And most of them end up as some little file lying around on my computer, probably until the heat death of the universe. But occasionally, some results do come out. So this is not going to be so much of a polished talk as I'm going to try to explain my ideas. And then I'm hoping Adam and the audience will get in and we can turn this into a discussion.
Mm.
But one thing that kind of starts here is also how far back into the past should we go in order to think about the future? So, as we say in the preface of the book, we started the book during lockdown in 2020. So literally in the garden outside my flat, Cyril and me were sitting at a socially distant distance and talking about things like disasters, government control over people in disasters. Nick Bostrom's idea of a singleton. Maybe we need some form of global coordination against the existential risk in the future, and that might be much, much more powerful than any form of coordination we see today. And of course, Cyril, being a professor of jurisprudence, brought up Thomas Hobbes' idea of Leviathan, this idea that we together, the body and the politic, the collective and the group of people, we should join together and elect a sovereign to rule for us, because that's the best alternative to the anarchy that you get otherwise. When, as Hobbes famously said, life would be nasty, brutish, and short. It's better to have a tyrant on top than just having chaos. Of course, he was thinking about monarchy at the end of the British Civil War. But today I think we have much better mechanisms for ruling us. Even if you don't give that much for, let's say, the current UK government, I think we're beating a lot of total monarchs in the past. They're, for all their ineptness, actually an even better system. And that gets to that interesting question about how do we actually solve the problem of living together? And I promise, this detour through history will end up in a very futuristic place. But I think first we might want to go really far back. So the idea of a body politic is one of those classic metaphors. As soon as people come together and build a society, they start making this metaphor that maybe society can be treated as a kind of body. There is some Egyptian scrolls that use this metaphor. There is a famous speech that is probably mythical in Roman history, where there was a rebellion where the plebeians were kind of taking a lot of space, and a general explained to them that so a body can't function if heart and stomach and brain don't work together. We all need to work together to make a society work. And this is probably a super easy metaphor to make, because we know bodies. We kind of understand that different parts of the body need to work together. So it seems like every civilization has some version of this. But then you can take the metaphor and say, maybe this is actually a description of how it works. We have different functions in society. Society has different kinds of organs. Let's develop this further. And you find this with Plato, you find it in Aristotle, and it keeps on going. What then happens a few hundred years later is that Christianity shows up. And in Christianity, there are two very weird bodies showing up historically. One is the body of Christ in the sense of the Eucharist. So when Jesus says that you're going to do this in memory of me, there was this idea that yes, that bread and wine was literally turning into the flesh and blood of Jesus. So that was one body. And then there was the other body, that was the body of Christ, that was the church. So both of them show up in the Bible. And both, of course, become very important as Christianity develops. But on one hand, the body of Christ as the church, now it's the idea that this is the manifestation of Christ in the world in the form of all good Christians doing good Christian things together, coordinated with, of course, a pope or a patriarch at the head. And then to make a long history of ideas short, there are weird contortions about what's what, but during the Middle Ages, this idea of the church as an actual body becomes real important, because they're starting to pick up stuff of contract law. They're starting to have organizations that are complicated, and they realize, we need to organize them. What are the rules here? And they're a bit like the church. So the concept of a university, that is something universal. It actually was originally treated as a body. And today we talk about research bodies, etc. Corporations, well, corpus, that's Latin for body. Again, we develop this idea that, we have collectives of people that form integrated wholes, and they are really important, legally speaking. And then what happens in the early modern era is that people start thinking about more and more how this works. So proponents of absolute monarchs are arguing that, it's very important, of course, to know that the body needs to be ruled by the head, and that's literally the head of the state. And they're also making these interesting links to that in an Eucharistic body. When people at the end of a reign of a king says, the king is dead, long live the king, they literally refer to two kings. One is the guy on the throne with a beard who just had a stroke. The other one is this metaphysical king who's the head of the state, who now immediately moves over to the chosen successor. So we're having these weird abstract corporate bodies that don't quite exist in the physical sense, but they're very important for law. They're important for whose decisions are legitimate. And we also build them up by having literal flesh and blood people do it. Of course, federalists point out that bodies actually function rather badly with any organ missing. It's not just the head that is important. You actually need all parts, and we can't put one above the others. What then happens, and this is where futurism starts very early, is Thomas Hobbes. So in the 1600s, he's describing his famous book Leviathan, all of this. And then he points out that we humans are currently taking ideas from nature and turning them into machines. We can see interesting things happen in nature and make a machine that imitates them. And just like we imitate various functions, we can imitate the functions of a human. We can make artificial humans. Think about it. This is the 1600s. We're talking about the middle of the Baroque era. People are walking around in wigs. The Royal Society is just about to be started. And people are talking about artificial humans. Of course, Hobbes was somewhat metaphorical, but he was honestly arguing that we can imitate everything in nature and make something similar. And a state is an artificial person or an artificial man. It has internal organs that do things. And then he argued, of course, that you need to have a king at the top because that's the only sane way of running things. After that, this body politic idea has kind of evolved in a lot of different ways. But the idea that you could make artificial body politics, it's not just that they're happening, they're not something organically that grows up, was suddenly thrown out among the other possibility, like maybe we could design a society. Maybe we could revolt, write a constitution, and make a sensible society based on that. Certain colonies went off and did that to great and sometimes mixed success. People started thinking that these organizations, these corporations, maybe they could be run in other ways. Maybe we could run them by sets of rules, or maybe run them by software. Actually, why don't we appoint an AI to the board of directors? So what is happening here is that we're playing around with creating collective organisms. And this is not strange, because this is how humans normally work. If we start out really far in the past at a campfire in the Neolithic and we're hungry, so we're debating what to do tomorrow, we might say, are we going to hunt rabbits or go for the big prize, the mammoth? And we are debating this, and then we might come up with a collective plan. Yeah, we're going to do it. We're going to hunt a mammoth. That's going to feed us all. And then we make a collective plan, and we have a collective intention. So next morning, the mammoths don't know what's going to hit them, because suddenly humans show up from various angles. They have made a plan beforehand. And some of them are driving them towards the edge of the cliff. Others are showing up with spears. And other people are waiting at the bottom of the cliff, etc. There is a lot of coordination going on that we made beforehand. But there is a problem here. We are stupid and we're selfish. So on one hand, the stupidity can be helped by having a discussion. So I might have one idea for how to hit the mammoth with a big rock. And then Adam sensibly points out that nobody else can lift rocks heavy enough to hit mammoths on the head. The idea dies instead of a bunch of hunters. We also solve these things by this collective cognition and by critiquing ideas. Sometimes that happens in the form of a normal discussion. Sometimes it might be a more ritual thing, like the classic academic debate where two people are standing on opposing sides and are arguing with each other. But we also have this big problem that occasionally people are just forgetful. We have made up a plan, but somebody didn't listen very much. So he comes charging out of the forest at totally the wrong moment, shouting Leroy Jenkins and scaring the mammoths in the wrong direction. Kind of, oh no. We need ways of kind of controlling our own stupidity. Even worse, some of us are extra hungry. I want more meat. I think I deserve more meat because I'm me. That's bad for the group. So one way of dealing with this is, of course, again, coming up with a way of sharing that meat. Not just, okay, whoever got the meat wins, because then we're going to end up fighting and the tribe is going to be a very small one. So instead, we come up with intentions and systems for sharing meat. And this is, of course, the secret sauce that is making humans run the planet for good and ill now. We coordinate, we create group intentions, we come up with ways of motivating each other. But evolution gave us an interesting way of doing that, normativity. So in philosophy, normativity is all about these things that we ought to be doing. Not just that it's possible to do them, but we should be doing them. And why we should be doing them, it's of course a big topic. That's basically what ethics is trying to deal with. And the big debate is even where normativity comes from. But you can make a totally deflationary account of this. You can say, actually, we just evolved that if people very solemnly tell us that God or spirits or our ancestors want us to do it like this, we tend to listen. When somebody says, you ought to be following the contracts, or your word should be the law for you, we react in a very different way from when people say the sky is blue or the mammoth is currently hiding behind the hill. Those are facts. normative things tend to drive our motivations. Not always in the right direction. Sometimes we're like little kids. When our parents tell us we must do something, we absolutely refuse. But what is going on here is probably that we have a psychological tendency to want to follow normative claims. Which one we trust as being proper ones and which ones are false, that's of course a complicated thing. But we are normative animals. We are going on around the campfire or in the village square or in the parliament or at the coffee table at the corporation, and quite often make these claims about normativity. And it allows us, our groups, to function well. We're making on the fly a lot of little rules. Pacta sunt servanda, that you always should do what agreements that you have made tell, is a good rule. It's a powerful rule because if you live according to that, it's not just that you might sometimes have a bit trouble because you need to bend over backwards to make contracts work, but others trust you. And societies where people teach each other that, yeah, you should follow rules, you should obey in your word, they tend to thrive. Societies where it kind of, do whatever you want, generally don't function as well. So what we argue in the book, this is kind of a first third, is that legal systems and a lot of small and big rules we have, like queuing, at least here in England, we take queuing extremely seriously. We regard it as a literal normative thing. If somebody queue jumps, they're bad. You must not do it, and most people shudder at the thought of actually doing it. So one of my favorite examples is that every September we have this little drama at the bus stop down at Magdalen Street. It's the Italian students arriving, and they have the wrong queue norms. So they ignore what we in the very British queue are doing. We are frowning at them. We are not happy at all. Speaking up, this is so extreme that sometimes people might even speak up in Britain, but it's rare. But by December, the Italians are standing there in the queue, in the rain, just like the rest of us. Because norms about queuing are really sticky. They're very normative and they imitate each other quite a bit. And also it makes a lot of sense. You avoid conflict, you get generally on average things work better. You could run queues in different ways. In Cuba, they developed another system, El Ultimo. You come to a group of people waiting, and either you ask or they point out who El Ultimo, the previously last one, was. So now you just keep an eye on him or her, and that way, when it's your turn, you know that. And new arrivals, of course, you tell them that, yeah, I was the last one. You can do this in a lot of different ways, and it's kind of arbitrary, but some of them are better. So we talk about pragmatic epistemic guidelines, that kind of these little systems, these little packages we do. And then we build up more elaborate one, precepts, which are kind of these pragmatic systems that embody a lot of information and we tend to take for granted. And they build up to bigger systems that are kind of global. They tend to be unique. There is a kind of Highlander principle going on. You can only typically have one legal system in a place. Why? Well, if there are two, they tend to rub against each other. You get a lot of friction. One reason Oxford had a very violent history during the Middle Ages was that you had the church legal system and the normal legal system. And the students and the faculty were all under the church legal system. So if they did something, they had to go to the church and the bishop gave them a stern talking to, and that was it. While if you were a normal townsperson, you get dragged before one of the king's judges and typically your head got chopped up. And people felt that was very unfair, hence a lot of rioting and hence a lot of work for the judges and bishop. Now, what eventually happened was, of course, the church system was replaced with one system. You can sometimes have other legal systems running in parallel. It's not entirely uncommon. There is a lot of hilarious and interesting examples in David Friedman's book, Legal Systems Very Different from Our Own. But typically that Highlander principle means that it makes sense to only have one market, only one language, only one of these big overarching systems. They tend to win out in the long run. And that is, of course, good because these big systems gives us a lot of peace and prosperity. That is kind of what a legal system is supposed to be doing. Maybe sometimes they start because some king comes in and conquers the place and says, I want a legal system that's really good for me. I want it to be good to be a king. But of course, that also means making sure nobody else gets to become king. So what happens is he sets up a legal system that is very much in his favor, but it also makes things predictable. It makes it easy to run business. Again, sometimes you get legal system that makes it hard to run business. Those countries tend to become poorer and get conquered by the neighbors who had slightly better legal systems that allowed them to afford a bigger army. So what happens is that you quite often, for very selfish reasons, get these big systems. And after a few generations, you forget why exactly the church is organized like that, why the legal system works like that. And the answer might very well have been that that king wanted something. But now it's his descendants, and they're bound by the system too. So what happens is generally that we have these big systems, very much impersonal, because they're running as an extended cognitive system. It's not just in the head of a king. It's his advisors, it's its judges, it's the lawmen going around, but also the citizens knowing kind of what the law is and what you should and shouldn't be doing. Because most of us are law-abiding, not because the police sees us, but because we kind of know what the law is and it makes sense to follow it. Sometimes because it's just a coordination mechanism. We all want to drive on the same side of a road, whichever side that happens to be in the country. Sometimes it's because it's a sensible rule. I don't like being robbed, so it's a good thing to have rules against robbery. And if I see a robbery, I want to get the police involved. So end result here is, in the case of law and markets, that we get this big system that contains quite a lot of cognition on different levels, specialized thinking spread out across a lot of minds. This is collective cognition for real. In a legal system, a forensics team, individuals there might not know all the methods that other members of a team do, but when they investigate a crime scene together, they can make a picture that can then be used to guide the police, which might be coordinating with citizenry in other ways. So when everything works well, we get peace and prosperity, and power to some, of course. This is great, but it's also powered by human autonomy. As Hayek famously pointed out about spontaneous orders, he was in particular thinking about markets, of course, is that the reason markets work so well is that a lot of people do things freely, and that sends signals about their preferences and coordinates us all, because those price signals make people produce more or less of different things. So we have this big extended system. Great. And then, of course, some people say, no, I can do better. Let's have a centrally planned economy. And this is, of course, where things generally tend to fall apart. As Hayek and Mises and others pointed out, actually, it is tricky to optimize this. I think it was Pareto who in the 1910s or 20s argued that, look, there are more than 15,000 goods in an economy. Nobody can solve the equation system with pen and paper. Now, it turns out that there are way more than 15,000 things in the economy. And indeed, linear programming, the method of trying to optimize production of different goods, was invented in the Soviet Union partially to solve the centrally planned economy problem. It didn't work that well, partially because, well, they didn't have enough compute to actually compute it. They tried to develop computers for this purpose, but ironically, the Soviet bureaucracy didn't work well together. The different departments refused to share resources and coordinate. Meanwhile, over in competitive America, people were happily sharing internet access and eventually built the internet by having different organizations working together freely without demanding payment from each other, unlike in the socialist economy. It's very ironic, but generally doing computation well didn't work very well in the East Bloc, even though some of them tried. There were interesting attempts in Yugoslavia where there actually existed a kind of centrally planned cybernetic company that was literally running its inventory and decision making in a distributed manner, but it never spread beyond the factory. There is a famous example in 1970s Chile where the government, having socialized industry, tried to centrally control them using Project Cybersyn, a very futuristic idea of using telex machines and computers to calculate the economy and send signals. It's one of those great what-ifs, because they had prepared a wonderful mock-up of a control room, literal Star Trek chairs, and a lot of interesting ideas. But then, of course, the military coup happened and it all ended up on the scrap heap of history. It was also a very centralized system. And as Pareto, Mises, and Hayek pointed out, you really can't run it like that because we have these distributed preferences. We have a lot of local knowledge, and that is hard to send into the central computer. Also, from a modern perspective, you can even calculate how much compute is needed to optimize an economy. And even assuming everything is a linear programming problem, it's actually way, way, way harder. It turns out that it takes about 540 million years to calculate things. That's a little bit too slow to do updates. The weird thing is, why does the normal market work? Because you can use some of the other computational theorems to prove that prices should convert very slowly. It should take exponential time in the worst case scenario. So why does the free market actually work? And the answer is, of course, yeah, it's distributed. A lot of autonomous local action that is powering this. And this is probably also why rule of law works, why a lot of other parts of society works. So far, this has sounded like a kind of lecture in history of ideas and sociology and psychology and a little bit about economics. So what does this have to do with the future and superintelligence? Well, the thing is, the collective minds, they're a concept that comes originally, at least in philosophy, from this famous paper by Clark and Chalmers, where they argue for the extended mind hypothesis. If Otto has bad memory and stores everything he needs to know in his notebook, then we should be treating that notebook as part of Otto's memory. There is a kind of correspondence principle. If information processing happens out there in ways that we normally would say are thinking if they happened inside the brain, why shouldn't we say that it's thinking when it happens outside the brain? So quite literally, my smartphone, I regard this very much as part of my mind. Now, you can, of course, get in bigger questions here. Is this mind? Is there consciousness hidden in my smartphone? And that might be pushing things too far, or maybe not far enough, depending on which philosopher you ask. But even distributed cognition is interesting, because that correspondence principle, there is nothing in that that says pieces of paper are the only things that can have externalized mind. After all, we have a lot of software in this phone. It's not the physical object that's interesting. It is the kind of processing. And AI software, couldn't that be part of this system? And the answer is, of course. And that's where things get interesting and slightly scary. Because these leviathans that we make up are now gradually getting more and more AI inside them. In some cases, it's very trivial things. We have some government decisions that are algorithmic, sometimes deliberately, because a government department realizes that we want to work 24/7, so certain approvals can be done using web forms. Maybe you can appeal the result, etc. There are the speed cameras that are typically detecting that you're speeding and sending you a fine. And unless you appeal, well, it's a totally automated system. But of course, quite a lot of people, when they need to send a report to the government, they spin up ChatGPT and generate something. And then there's probably an overworked bureaucrat getting that wordy report, asking ChatGPT, could you please summarize it? What does Anders actually say? So we're getting AI infiltrating there. We're also, of course, using AI to make decisions. Quite a lot of people these days ask for legal advice from the LLMs. And it's not necessarily bad legal advice. Sure, sometimes it's totally wrong, sometimes it's totally made up. But if you go and ask your friends, actually, they're also about as bad. If you ask a lawyer, well, if he or she is on the clock, you're going to probably get a fairly high quality in the result. But in many cases, you can't afford that, or it's not worth it for the small things that you just want to check. And I think it's very clear that over time, we're seeing more and more legal activity being done by AI software. We know that the law is something that language models can learn. There are limits, there are interesting problems about what they hallucinate and do right, but it's creeping in there. And as soon as we start having our little law bots looking out for a legal interest, everybody else is going to need them. Because of course some bad guys are going to have very little virtual law bots trying to sue everybody around them frivolously. And if you don't have a law bot, oh dear, you're going to get sued and have to pay money. So you better get yourself a lawbot. There is this ratcheting effect, just like today it's rather hard to live in society if you haven't got a proper smartphone. Or for that matter, having a safe computer if you haven't got a firewall and antivirus software. So there is a ratcheting effect where we mediate more and more of our social lives through AI. I spent the day interacting with about a dozen different AI agents and the systems, writing papers, doing research, planning. They're part of my extended self. I believe this is going to keep on going. And then, of course, people are getting other interfaces, including their virtual boyfriends and girlfriends, and the various lawbots, and their coaches, and all the other software. Meanwhile, organizations are going to get this too. And I think algocracy, using algorithms to run bureaucracy, is going to, in the long run, become very big. There is, of course, also a risk that you get even a top-down thing, that various organizations get de facto run by artificial intelligence. Not necessarily that the AI takes them over straight away, but the CEO listens to the advice of his advisors, and the advisors listen to the advice from their advice bots. And the advice bots in the corporate pool, they're of course sharing information that the corporation knows and generate a feedback loop. So quite often these systems might be invisibly taken over. This is not necessarily a bad thing if the AI is aligned. If we manage to make our AI systems aligned with human interests, everything is more or less fine. Might still be a bit of a problem though, because what we talk about in the book is what we call the serfdom conclusion, because we might end up with systems that are almost completely software. And that means that we get even more peace and prosperity, assuming we solve the alignment problem, so it's not all crashing and burning. Great. We get loads of peace and prosperity, but human autonomy that previously was necessary for making the decisions, getting the local information out onto the market, is no longer important. The little agent sitting inside my phone is observing what I'm doing, noticing that Anders is probably getting hungry given the signals from his body. Okay, let's find a meal for him according to his values and what is available, etc. At that point, I don't need to make a decision. I could make a decision on my own, of course. I could skip that meal, but it's probably a stupid thing. And we might end up in a world where human autonomy is not needed at all. It used to be necessary to get peace, prosperity, to run complicated things. But now we outsource the cognition and autonomy is not needed. This seems creepy to many of us. Not everybody. Some people might actually like being a pet or a pampered aristocrat in this world. Indeed, I ran a little Twitter poll some year ago where I asked, so if we have aligned superintelligence running the world, would you like to live a life like a pampered aristocrat but with no real autonomy? And I, of course, expected humanity to rise up and say, no. Turns out that 75% of the respondents said, yes, please sign me up. But 25% of us think there's something queasy about this. What is that? And I think if we leave out all the ethics, which I actually do think is a very powerful argument for autonomy on its own, I think the real deep down psychological reason is simply none of our ancestors liked giving up autonomy, because the ancestors that gave up autonomy tend to get overruled by everybody else. They didn't have many kids. It was an evolutionary disadvantage. We are the kind of creatures who need autonomy to feel good about ourselves. Then, of course, the funny part is we quite often give it away. I'm married. I gave away a little bit of my autonomy, but in return, I got a wonderful husband. Yay. If I start working for a company, I give away some of my autonomy, but I get a salary and maybe other perks. This can be a very good deal. Indeed, trading our autonomy is an important part of the human condition. Sometimes we have these very hard choices that we need to deal with. So I think that is part of why we want to retain autonomy. And that, of course, leads to this interesting question. What is it that we need to aim for now? Because it seems like the AI revolution is really accelerating. Of course, it's been accelerating for a long while, but it's accelerating even more obviously right now. And it might be that we need to solve some of these problems very soon. I used to think that AI alignment and AI safety, interesting questions, and it's a good thing we're working on it, because in a few decades when AI starts going, then we might have some good solutions. That turned out to be a lot fewer decades than we expected. I'm still one of those people who don't think AGI is super mega imminent, but the world is getting transformed by AI anyway. You don't necessarily need super intelligence or AGI to end up in these big systems that I've been describing. And that suggests that we might want to take care about design them. So I think we need not just first order alignment, and that is AI that is kind of safe to be around, that does what is in our interests. But you also want second order alignment. You want the niches that we can live in. We humans need the niche where we can be autonomous about our own lives. If we don't get that, we don't feel that good. Many people might be relatively fine, but I think we're better off if we actually have a lot of individual autonomy. But we don't necessarily want full autonomy about everything in the world. My autonomy kind of ends where yours begins. If I want to have weapons of mass destruction because I like collecting on them, collecting weapons of mass destruction, that's such a risky hobby that probably we should limit my ability to do that. I don't get to have a bunch of plutonium cores around my flat. My neighbors are very right in complaining if I do that. So we want to say, we want to actually have autonomy where it matters and where it makes sense. But there is a downside on too much autonomy in some domains, like weapons of mass destruction. So in game theory, there is this interesting concept of the price of anarchy. This is the difference between the best possible outcome when agents are playing some game or coordinating and what you actually get as an equilibrium. And the ratio between these ones can be very different. Now, it turns out that in the case of existential risk, the price of anarchy is essentially infinite. If we go extinct because somebody makes a doomsday virus, that's not good at all. While in the best possible outcome is continued existence, and the ratio is enormous. What's the price of anarchy in my own life? Well, maybe I'm not following the advice of my clever little AI agent that is giving me the most healthy lunch possible. I'm taking the hamburger instead. That's bad for my health, but the difference is relatively modest, and the damage doesn't spread very far. Well, the cows might complain, of course, so there is still some effects, but it seems to me that there is this individual level where actually the price of anarchy is pretty bearable, and the price of sovereignty, when I lose my feeling of control of my life, is pretty harsh. On the global level, most of us don't really feel that the UN Security Council is an infringement of our autonomy. Most of us probably wished it was a more sane organization that actually could help the world rather than constantly veto each other. We might then say, over here, on the larger scale, we want global coordination. We want to use the biggest and most effective AI systems or other collective orders. But now we get to the final interesting part. If we manage to play this game right, if we manage to set up the ground rules for what we want our AI to do, we are also going to be able to coordinate better. That Stone Age tribe could only coordinate around the campfire. Today, we can use the internet to coordinate millions of people if we have a good idea. In the future, we might have tools that literally get billions of people, billions of minds, and perhaps trillions of AI programs working on a problem if it's necessary. If there is a crisis, humanity might actually coordinate enormously much more powerfully, simply because we reduce the transaction cost, we improve the economies of scale. And that means that humanity might get new interesting properties. In ethics, we quite often talk about virtue ethics. So there are kind of three big schools of ethics. There are the deontologists who say there are certain rules you need to follow. There is the consequentialists who say we need to make sure that the outcome is the best. And then there's the virtue ethics school that says, you need to act well. You need to find behavior patterns and habits that produce good results. I'm more of a consequentialist myself, but I read a fair bit of virtue ethics recently, and I kind of like it. It's much more fun papers, at least from a literary sense, than the consequentialist ones, which tend to be fairly boring in many ways. But the virtue ethics approach means that I need to do the right thing for the right reason. A person saving people from a battlefield because he's very nearsighted and nearly deaf and doesn't notice it's a battlefield, he's not brave. He's doing something very good. We should thank him for it, but he's not being brave. He just doesn't understand what he's doing. The invisible hand of the market might make us all better off. But that doesn't mean the invisible hand on the market is kind of doing it virtuously, because it's not intending anything. It's a mechanism of how we set up a market and some of equilibria and what happens in economics. The interesting part is that you want to have systems that are virtue apt. And traditional philosophers would say, of course, only people are virtue apt. More recently, people have started to realize actually collectives can be doing this too, which of course folds in rather nicely with these leviathans I'm talking about. You could say that that team is being very smart. And you might say that all the members of the team are dumb, but the team is organized in the right way, so they produce smart outcomes. You might say that a group of soldiers are being very brave, even though none of the soldiers inside it necessarily is that brave, but they're all goading each other into doing stuff, and the end result might be true bravery if the internal process actually works. Again, lots of philosophical debates about how these processes actually need to function, etc. When it comes to environmental virtues, this is more obvious. We cannot really individually be good for the environment. We need to do that as a group. It's not like, it's very unlikely that I could cause a species to go extinct individually. But as a society, we can totally do that. And you might then blame the society and say that that was bad. Or look at that other society next door. They've actually got good green policies. The members understand why they should be good for the environment. They set up institutions and rules and mechanisms. And even though most people don't really want to recycle that much and really don't like those carbon pricing things, they actually bind each other in the right way to generate an overall behavior of that society that is actually good for the environment. So I think what might happen is that as we coordinate better and better, as we add more intelligence and agency on higher levels, we might actually make humanity as a whole into something that could be virtue apt. We might actually turn humanity into something that is prudent in avoiding existential risk. We might actually get a form of autonomy for humanity. Right now, we have a lot of people. We're doing a lot of things. Sometimes we form groups and coordinate about big intentions and ideas. But we're rather bad at doing things as a species. If we ever got a message from aliens, how do we respond? Well, maybe it's the United Nations who's supposed to do it, but I bet there's going to be a dozen governments saying, we're totally going to send our own message, and probably a lot of private people saying, no, I'm going to privately send a message back. Coordination is hard. We might be better at coordination in the future. And that might not be possible with just humans. It might be that we actually need to be part of a kind of cyborg leviathan. We're already able to do many fantastic things by being this integrated cyborg organism. When COVID struck, one of the parts of humanity that actually functioned best was a small cyborg called the scientific and medical community that very quickly sequenced the DNA, distributed it widely, and various parts analyzed it, and Google DeepMind, and did a molecular modeling of it. People came up with vaccines and started manufacturing and testing them in a very distributed fashion. That's part of our collective technological immune system that is in some sense enhancing us. And I think we might see this scaled up for future crises, but also maybe for just coordinating where we want to be going. Intentions might flow up in the best of all possible futures, that people promote them online, they get debated by humans and machines alike. And if some of them make sense, and the simulations and the prediction markets say, this is actually a good idea, they percolate up towards the decision layers, whether that is markets or governments or think tanks or actual robot armies on the moon or whatever you have, leading to action. So I think the full potential of humanity might actually be that we, to some extent, become both a cyborg and in some sense a group organism. We're already kind of there, but we're doing it piecemeal. We're doing it accidentally, and we might want to think a little bit about how to do it in the right way, so it's also worth being part of this big system. Yeah, that was roughly
Awesome.
what I'm writing about.
Well, that's amazing, Anders. I'm very glad that you're the one who's looking at these subjects more closely. Yeah, I thought it was fascinating. You spoke about a number of things that I found interesting. I took some notes. If there's any other questions, um, so you spoke about normativity and that we can have, you can say that they came about through a deflationary account of normativity. I'm not exactly sure what you meant by a deflationary account.
Well, think about a balloon that just goes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
There are
yeah. I
many, many
understand.
concepts in philosophy and elsewhere that are very impressive. But quite often, when you start poking at them, you start wondering, is there actually something fundamental here? And many philosophers would argue, no, 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 normativity is actually really, really impressive and important. But you can also take the view that actually maybe it's something very primitive and simple. And the reason we do this is partially because of a complicated thing dealing with the history of Scandinavian legal philosophy. Because of Hägerström, there is a strain of thought that is very important in Sweden about what legal science is about, and that kind of has at its core this idea that yeah, talking about ethics and morals is kind of beside the point. So they go by error theory. Error theory is the meta-ethical view that all this ethics talk is kind of wrong because it doesn't point at anything. Rights and wrongs don't quite exist. So when people make these big claims, they're actually not pointing at anything real. And yet it's pretty obvious that even if you believe that, people take promises seriously. If you don't take promises seriously, your reputation will suffer. If you take promises seriously, you will be known as somebody who's reliable. That's generally good for you. And generally, even psychologically, many of us feel bad about breaking promises. Maybe some nihilists are just saying, haha, I just broke a promise and I feel nothing. But even that sounds a bit weird. So this deflationary account is basically, okay, let's not assume any of the ethical stuff. I actually believe a lot of this ethical stuff is really actually true, and I think error theory is not true. But in this book, we're kind of just arguing as if it was. Because if we can make this fly, even without making use of any of the ethical theories, then it's likely true no matter which ethical theory is actually true.
Oh, that's very useful. Yeah, might consider that myself. I'm a moral realist as well. I think that you might lean that way too. It seems to be the most popular among philosophers, according to the Phil Paper survey. Um, but it is interesting. I think like the normativity that we get, we choose because of practical reasons. Often it is the case, or whatever's prudential for me at the time. Oh yeah, I'll just obey to the traffic signals because I don't want to die, or I'll drive on the left side of the road because everybody else is. Yeah, so I mean, it makes total sense for people acting in their own self-interest to potentially follow these kinds of these norms that everybody seems to want to agree to. But some people seem to find their ways around them, and some people get away with it and get really rich.
Oh yeah, and that is another interesting part because you want to set up a system so you prevent this from happening too much. So generally, our response when people break the norms is to push back. In the case of a British queue, it's kind of giving people a sharp look and raising your eyebrow very meaningfully. Uh, but we might also set up rules saying that insider trading, yep, it has a jail sentence. And then, of course, making rules that, yeah, and if you notice somebody insider trading and not telling the police, maybe that is also illegal. What is going on here is that we're trying to make the altruistic punishment system work. So in game theory, people talk about altruistic punishment. That is, when you do something to punish people who break norms, even if it costs you. And the problem is, of course, this is a very fragile state because if it costs you to punish people, then you're actually better off not punishing norm breakers up until the point everybody's breaking the norms and suddenly nothing works and you're worse off. So the problem is maintaining that. And the solution we have in modern societies is typically that we outsource it to the police, we outsource it to the traffic cameras, we come up with ways of shoring it up. But we can do it by laws. We can have laws saying that, yeah, if you see certain kinds of crime, you must tell the police about it. Otherwise, you're going to be guilty of some smaller crime. So now we bias things and try to lock that in. And this can stabilize cooperative systems quite a bit. But cooperative systems also get stabilized in a lot of other wonderful ways. Elinor Ostrom, who got the Nobel Prize a few years back, did this wonderful work on how people govern commons around the world. And a lot of this governance is very informal, based on weird traditions, and it doesn't look at all like the rational rules some game theorists would promote. In many cases, it's very much traditional rules, and it's a lot of singing and dancing and ancestral traditions going on. But that helps shoring up these rules that actually are helpful. The problem is, of course, sometimes a lot of this extra stuff is totally hiding the actual system that actually helps people coordinate well. So there is a real risk that sometimes when people become rational, they throw out the baby with the bathwater. But if you do it in the right way, you can shore up fragile coordination. You can shore up the trust between strangers, so you can run a large society.
Yeah, right. So a lot of this does seem to come down to identifying the signal around the customs, what's going on. Like, hey, people are doing the dancing, singing, and doing tribal traditions, but what's that? What is the crux of why that's happening? Maybe more than one, of course. It could be community bonding. It could be reinforcing memories. It could be, enforcing norms that everybody celebrates and then learns to, adopt, or through a process of osmosis, maybe. But like, there's got to be some reasons why these things happen. Identifying those reasons is really interesting when it comes to existing customs and all that sort of thing, right?
And then, of course, the question how
mean,
we can make new customs, because we
yes,
need to invent new
that's correct.
norms. We need to come up with better ways for the new problems we're meeting, whether that is behavior online. We need to have proper politeness and customs rules that we can get people to understand. We probably need to develop norms about how we apply AI in various situations. Right now, there is total chaos in the academic world where we're trying to figure out how do you acknowledge the amount of help you got from an AI program in writing a paper. And we probably should have a norm for that. We just don't know what it is, and that makes it very exciting for the moment. But of course, we might even try to invent entirely new kinds of norms to bring things into existence. Hyperstition, the way of
Yeah.
creating things by behaving as if they're true,
Yes.
is getting more and more working in a world where we have AI, 3D printers, markets that look for things to sell to you. And we might actually be able to create norms that create good institutions. But of course, the problem is doing so wisely. And wisdom is unfortunately relatively hard to come by.
Right, yes. When you talk about hyperstition, you could end up having value drift or norm drift into regions of the landscape of values, as I like to call it, that could be very dangerous, or just could be just boring, right? Or just
Yeah,
absurd, right?
yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, like, yes, hyperstition is good as long as you're wise about doing that. But part of the procedure, how do you get wise? Is it just by learning from mistakes? Or can you make predictions? Can you get good at predicting what the landscape of norms could be, what cultures could be, and select through them based of, define your trajectory along the landscape towards attractor basins or whatnot that
I
support
think that is
wise norms?
doable. I have a colleague in Stockholm, Pontus Strimling, who's a wonderful mathematical sociologist, the closest you get to a psychohistorian. And he's
Oh,
actually
really?
looking at how norms change and how they update over time and some of the internal logic in that. So there is information about it. There is empirical data. We can make some predictions. But there is also other aspects that are just hard to predict because, like Popper pointed out, the future is set by ideas, and you can't predict many ideas before you got them. So these ideas might pop up, and then you can't know what the consequences they have. But I think we can work on this, and we can get better. So normally I say that intelligence is the ability to solve problems in accordance with your goals efficiently across a lot of the environments. But wisdom is the ability to select your goals well.
Yes.
And that is partially something we learn. One reason that as you grow up, you become a little bit wiser is that you actually can see empirically, both in your own life and in others, what some goals lead to. But you also might learn a little bit about the patterns, about what functions and what doesn't function. Some people are much better at it than others, just like some people are smarter than others. But I do think that wisdom can be improved as a learning process. And I think this is something we might be able to empower using AI in various ways too.
Absolutely, and we may have brought this up last interview I did with you, and that was my favourite part in Nick Bostrom's superintelligence book was the one on indirect normativity, where you don't have to feed in AI, a specific set of norms, values, or goals that you may have at a particular point in history, or that that may be utterly confused if you aggregate all the values of humanity. But you can get AI to help, determine what norms, what good starting conditions of Utopia 1.0 could be through this process of indirect normativity. I find that very appealing, although it's not very popular, it seems.
Well, yeah, but you're of course in the position to make it more popular by arguing for it, by suggesting it. Other people might push back, might argue back, but we're in this collective world of ideas being bounced against each other. I'm very much of a classical liberal. I believe in the marketplace of ideas, and I think in the long run, truth and sensible ideas tend to win out. The problem is the long run is quite often much longer than the amount of disinformation. Disinformation can cause a lot of damage, and in a very dynamic world, actually this slow convergence towards something sensible might actually be too slow if the world is too turbulent. But I do think that this kind of forum is important because this is where we can discuss the big picture, not just in the term of a very long-term future, but also the big picture in terms of ideas, moralities, ways of getting better at doing this.
Indeed. So this marketplace of ideas or values, I mean, like I like the idea, but I'm worried that it could be influenced by people with, just their own values.
Well,
Like they
that's
might
has always happened.
bias the extrapolation base in a sense.
Well, in some sense, of course, that is the fear philosophers always have had about democracy. Oh no, what about demagogues? They're just going to convince a lot of people about stupid stuff and then they vote the demagogues into power, which honestly does happen from time to time. Populism is what it is. But the marketplace of ideas stretches not just over the present, but in the long run. Today I was going through an academic debate from the 1800s about the issue in classical mechanics. They could not imagine that 100 years after they were arguing this in their journals, an AI program would have dug up the references and directed a Swede who was interested in a crazy mega scale engineering project to use their debate. And of course, in the paper I'm writing, now I'm bringing up that debate and those questions, and maybe some other person or entity henceforth is continuing this discussion about this small part. That marketplace stretches across time and space, and sometimes you do get intense distortions. That's true, but we can work around that too. It's just that we need to survive the distortions.
Yeah, that I don't know how to answer how to survive those distortions, except, if we're gonna, hopefully the marketplace prioritizes safety, which is, you mentioned a couple of orders of alignment, the first order alignment and the second order alignment. Now, I'm not sure what most people think about what is the first order of alignment and the second, right? One of the things I
It's
worry about is existential
my
security.
choice of terms. Indeed, I'm writing an info box for my book, literally trying to define them properly. But as I say, first order alignment is making the AI work for you to be compatible with human survival, that it doesn't wreck the world just straight away. The second order alignment is making sure that it also doesn't wreck those complex social orders we need to live in, that it doesn't destroy the niche we humans need to function in. We could end up as pets for the super AIs, and that might still be livable, but it might not be a very good existence. You don't get flourishing. And I think there is a third order alignment, getting AI aligned with AI. One of the funniest things you can do today is take output from one LLM and give it to another one for critique. And they absolutely have a competitive streak. And that's kind of fine for intellectual discourse, but it might be a bit more risky if the AI programs start hacking each other. We might end up in a world where, left to our own devices, the AIs might give us a nice flourishing niche. But now, unfortunately, we're in a big war against each other, so we might get trampled underfoot, which was never anybody's intention, but these things happen in war. So you want to develop this kind of third order alignment once you have a big AI economy too.
Yeah, well, that kind of resonates with an idea I've been sort of swirling around in my head, and that's indirect alignment. Instead of aligning humans, AI to humans, or AIs to whatever other AIs, it's aligning to norms or aligning to nice places on the landscape of value, so that, if there's agreement on what norms are good, there's a range, there's a space of norms that are sort of agreeable by everybody, then align to that instead of directly aligned to each other. I'm not sure. I mean, yeah. So getting AIs to align
And
to each other,
yeah,
that sounds interesting. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I think one thing we can use here is also legal systems are kind of an interesting example. There are a norm system that we have developed. There is loads and loads and loads of training text in the form of legal data. And it has been suggested, I think his name is Ney, that we could use this to work on AI alignment. And even if it doesn't give you the proper AI alignment, just getting law-abiding AI might also be actually quite valuable. You don't really want your robot to go out and commit crimes.
Yeah, right. So there stands independent norms that everybody's sort of agreed to obey just by virtue of keeping cohesive society rolling on, right? And to,
And then
to
maybe
get
the AIs can
predictability.
say, yeah, and then maybe the AIs can say, okay, let's build on this. Let's, you have these legal rules, but actually there is a lot of stupid holes that are totally obvious to a mind like mine. And that might be the next step.
Right. Yeah. So
Cool.
let's see, how much time have we got until the next session? I'm just hurriedly
I
looking at the
think
schedule now.
I think my session is ending now, and then I'm supposed to
Ah,
show up in
yes.
an hour.
Yes. Yep, that's correct. And we have Yosha Bark, who should be starting at 8:30. Yeah. Okay,
Uh-huh.
cool. Yeah, so
Cool.
we've got half an hour, but if you'd like a break, you're welcome to go. But Yosha Bark is going to be talking about the machine consciousness hypothesis, and then we have a panel with both Anders and
Mm.
Yosha Bark
Yeah,
on
so I
it.
better come in and listen to what he's saying so I can see if I
Mm.
can respond to it.
We do have
Because
a question. Yeah, we do have a question from the audience,
mhm.
sorry. And that is, in the absence of lies and in the presence of love, and the inverse, which could be how to find alignment, if I read that correctly.
Yeah, I think love is interesting because one of the nicest way of defining love is saying you care about another person regardless of whether they care about you. There is something very altruistic about it. But then, of course, that caring quite often involves you actually need to understand them well enough to do things that are good for them and that they enjoy, etc. And of course, in the case of love that actually functions, these are two people that care for each other in this roughly the same way, and that produce a lot of good results. You ideally want to have something like that in AI alignment. You want the AI to care for you.
Hmm.
The problem is, of course, the second part of alignment, what kind of rules and norms, etc., that's separate from the first part. How do I make caring actually happening? How do you link the goals of the system so it actually, they are about you or about anything rather than just being playing around with symbols. One of the
Hmm.
problems with LLMs right now is that they don't really care. They don't really have goals. They're good at faking it up to a point, but I don't think they're really functioning on their own as having real caring or real goals. They're getting
Ye-
better at it, and I think we're getting systems that string them together that might very well be doing it. Similarly, truthfulness and not lying is also important. You actually want a world that is converging a little bit on reality. Because if you don't care too much about reality, you might start drifting. It's not just the values might be drifting. Your model of the world is wrong. So even if you do a very smart decision, it's not going to work because it's actually failing at linking with world. And if you don't care about being right about the world, then you're gonna just kind of paper over that failure and say, oh yeah, I actually intended that. So the end result might very well be a very dangerous divergence from what works. You get bad results, but you refuse to think that it's bad. And if you don't care, well, in that case, you're just going to go off the deep end. Is kind of truthfulness and caring enough, truthfulness and love enough for alignment? I doubt it. I think it's a much more technical question, but it's a great slogan. And I think we obviously want these things anyway. Having systems that actually try to care for us, even if they fail at it, is interesting and valuable. It also gets to a very deep philosophical question what caring actually deeply means. Similarly,
Yeah.
trying to be truthful, it's non-trivial. I find it very confusing as a researcher sometimes to tell the truth in a paper because I don't know what's going on here. I don't understand all the implications of the mathematics, yet can I take credit for all the implications? No, I haven't been thinking this through well enough, and my brain is too small for it. And I bet
Yeah.
the AI might say that in the future too. Oh yeah, I'm super intelligent, but unfortunately this is slightly beyond me. Just wait until I build a hyper intelligence. It's going to solve all our problems.
Yes, the ultra intelligence. Yes, I'm going to be speaking later on whether AI can be more moral than us. And one of the cruxes isn't just if AI is more capable. It's not even if it's not just performantly good at solving moral problems. It actually understands them, but if it really doesn't care about them, if we haven't solved the moral motivation problem or the normative motivation problem, then yeah, it could end up that AI catalogs all this ethics right next to the mating habits of dung beetles, right? Yeah, it's just another little set of symbols that we can put over there in the symbol library for cataloging. So you spoke about love. Yes. What about do you think it's important for a cyborg leviathan to have a permeable love throughout it all? Like, should all the, should the leviathan have the virtue of love?
That's a good question. It's not even obvious to me that love is a virtue on its own. Again, one can get into the debates about what lists of virtue actually are valid, but uh, ideally, you want a system that cares for its parts in the right way. After all, as a human, you want to care for your body. But that care is weird because we don't care about every single cell. In fact, many cells we want to get rid of. Some of them are kind of we're sloughing off skin, and that is a good way of functioning as a human. On the other hand, we really want to get rid of those cells that might be a bit rebellious, precancerous cells. But I also want to eat healthy food so I'm well. I want to ensure that I get vaccinations so my body doesn't get infected with various things. And that's not right now. Quite often we do it in a slightly selfish thing. I think, okay, it's my body, it's good for me, but you could also actually love your body. You could actually say that, yeah, my gut is actually, it's been with me all my life and I really get along with it fairly well, except after that chili. But besides quarrels like that, there is something about the integration between the different parts. So again, that caring is interesting because if you imagine a system that cares for its part for their own sake, that seems to be one of the best things you could imagine. If you imagine a state that actually cares for its citizens and wants the citizens' lives to go well for their own sake, not just because it's good for the economy, that sounds like a society you actually might want to live in, assuming the state is competent. It might be absolutely horrifying if the state is incompetent. It really cares. It really wants to help you. Unfortunately, it's bad at it, which is honestly a lot of liberal critique against a lot of government interventions. Quite a lot of government interventions might have been done with the best intentions, whether from people or systems, but they end up working rather badly. But I still think that's better than the society where the state just treats people as, well, they're fungible units. We can send them out in the war, or we can use them to generate GDP, and that's good for the state. that's a really bad situation to be in. That's the wrong kind of leviathan to be part of.
Yeah, this is one of the Halloween risk scenarios I think we spoke about when AI, death by meta ethics, where it thinks, okay, well, we just repurpose our atoms and turn the universe into hedonium or whatever. Everything's fungible after all, but that neglects the person affecting view. It doesn't, there's no intrinsic interest in particular individuals or beings alive, right?
But again, that body metaphor, kind of coming full circle, it's interesting because most of us don't have a particular interest for particular cells or particular small organs. I'm a little bit of a biology and medicine nerd, so I sometimes find it absolutely fascinating when I can kind of detect some of my physiological functions and I start obsessing about it for a little while. But most of the time, of course, I don't care. Most of the time, I'm striding down the street and I have some plan. And exactly what my left kidney is doing at that moment is none of my concern. I don't feel it. I don't necessarily feel like, oh, I need to protect it to any cost. Of course, if I get a kidney stone, I'm gonna change my tune very quickly. But the interesting part is when we create these kind of extended systems, we often don't do it like a creation. It's something that happens very ad hoc. It's a spontaneous order, like the market. It's something that happens because people join an organization online or a movement or spread memes. It's very organic. This is great quite often because you get distributed information in. The problem that happens is, of course, quite often that means that also you get a lot of awkward properties. Many organizations I've been in have had strong founder effects. There is a ridiculous overrepresentation of Swedes in existential risk research. Why? Probably a bunch of founder effect from me and Nick Bostrom and a few Swedes who randomly ended up early on, and that dragged in more Swedes. So we're overrepresented. Sometimes that can be good, sometimes it's neutral, sometimes it's really bad because you can get a movement started by people with some quirk and that quirk just gets propagated. So when we create these big composite organisms, we probably need to try to find ways of dealing with it. We might need to learn gardening. We might kind of garden this growing organic whole in a way that avoids some obvious problems. And we do this with organizations. We have various mechanisms like having oversight committees. We have checks and balances. We have ways of dealing with some well-known failure modes. Many of them are done in a fairly bureaucratic way, but they can get integrated in a sensible organization too. And I think this is worth considering when we build our cyborg exoselves and the cyborg organizations. We should try to learn as much as possible about what could go wrong or have gone wrong and try to build in antibodies against it.
Yeah, fascinating. Do you think that, is there any, like, do you think the symbol grounding problem needs to be solved by AI in order for it to be properly motivated to care? Does it need, or does it need sentience? Does it need some sort of experiential phenomenal access to pleasure and pain? You mentioned the problem of getting AI to care is an unsolved philosophical problem. Is that right? I might have misheard you.
Well, I think
But
it's
yeah,
more of
what?
a technical problem.
Yes.
Maybe it's a philosophical problem, but I think it's mostly a real technical issue. And it might be linked to the symbol grounding problem. So the standard symbol grounding problem is, so I'm thinking about a concept, how is that linked to the actual thing out in the world? A classic question about semantics and the philosophy of language and all that. But in neuroscience, of course, we have this problem. I have electrical impulses running around in my brain. How do they actually relate to things outside? Is it an actual representation of the world going on in my brain? And right now in my visual cortex, I have a rough map of what I'm seeing. But that rough map then gets processed in more and more advanced forms. And some of that maybe turns into my internal representation of faces and text and computers and whatnot. But exactly how that works is still somewhat mysterious. Now, the real problem is AI, because here it's suddenly very urgent. So when an AI system is talking about something in the actual world, what does it talk about? And back in the early days, you could say, oh, it's a stochastic parrot. There is nothing it's talking about. It's just predicting words. So when I ask it to associate the things to the redness of a rose, it's just listing common examples. I don't think that is as true as it used to be. I think we actually built architectures that do show evidence that we have internal representations that seem to be derived from this in complex and unexpected ways. There seem to be a lot of things going on there that might be that, insofar as I have never experienced the redness of a rose with my brain, I only seen it with my eyes and got the nerve impulses from my eyes. Maybe we're actually reaching the same situation here. Claude doesn't see a rose, but it read the millions of text describing roses, and that might actually start binding it a little bit. Many people would be very skeptical. It's still just text. But what about the multimodal AI? The AIs that generate video? Many of them actually have an implicit physics, which is interesting because they've not been trained to simulate physics. They have been trained to make videos. So they're really good at fluid dynamics because there's so many videos where liquids are flowing. And even experts on fluid dynamics say, wait a minute, it's getting some of these obscure non-linear things that 20 years ago you could do a PhD about. Now you're just getting it automatically here. What's going on? It seems like it's actually getting an internal representation that is based on having observed a lot of stuff in the world. And at this point, maybe there is some symbol grounding. It might still be a bit haphazard. It might be partial. But then again, so is our symbol grounding. My concept of a rose might be relatively concrete, but there are many other things, like obscure metals like hafnium, that to most people is just an abstraction. I happen to have a piece of hafnium in the bookshelf a few meters away. I know what it feels like. So in some sense I can ground it. Except, of course, maybe the guy who sold it to me actually gave me a piece of nickel and just printed hafnium on it. I can't tell them apart. I'm not good enough at chemistry. So that grounding might still be partial. But I think it's important for making systems that reach out and touch the world. I don't necessarily think they have to be conscious to do it. I think there's a lot of grounding that you don't need to be conscious or sentient to do. I think we quite often overrate how important it is. But then again, I'm a lousy philosopher of mind. I leave that to Joshua.
Yeah, definitely. That's really interesting. You brought up the idea that it seems grokking and few shot learning and then one shot learning and things like that seem to be pointing behavioralistically at the idea that internal representations within LLMs are supporting symbolic reasoning. Well, that's what I'm calling it, right? You didn't use those words, but there was an
Because it
interesting
might
paper.
not even be a symbol. After all, grokking, when you teach an LLM to do mathematics, it sometimes means that it builds this internal model of a number line and what the operations are. It's a very, very weird model compared to how we normally would think about it, although there might be equally strange things up in our heads when we're thinking about magnitude and number. But you create a model that maps onto the outside reality much more strongly and might actually be isomorphic to it. It's a bit like Dennett's argument that sometimes the easiest way of faking something is to have a property. So he was kind of arguing that, yeah, maybe you could get consciousness by having AI faking consciousness well enough. I don't know what he would be saying right now about AI consciousness. He was kind of optimistic when he said that, but that was a bunch of years ago, before the LLM revolution. And at least near the end, he was also a bit worried about counterfeit people, that we might get a lot of people who are just cheap fakes, but hard enough to tell apart. They might not be conscious, and they're very much sock puppets for various other entities, but that is a real social problem. So he might be have ended up a bit more pessimistic than he was when he gave that speech over in Cambridge. But I do think it's true that sometimes if you fake something well enough, you actually latch on to the underlying pattern. And even if it's maybe not perfectly grounded in some powerful philosophical set, it might still be mapping onto reality, because reality actually obeys various rules.
Fascinating. Yeah, I'd be interested to know more about that. Yes, the paper that I was going to mention was emergent symbolic mechanisms support abstract reasoning in large language models. So, I mean, that's, yeah, like, I don't know how, the neurosymbolic AI is tracking in the real world, but it seems to be, a focus of attention. Do you have much hope for neurosymbolic AI in the future? So a
I
hybrid of, yeah.
Yeah, I think that is probably the best way of doing it. After all, the work I've been doing today, writing a paper together with Claude, what is going on there is I have a big neural network somewhere up in the cloud going through a lot of text, generating more text. I'm taking some of that text, turning that into a paper, feeding it back in. Some parts of that paper are equations, and I got a symbolic manipulation of equations. And there is one step in a proof. I said, I don't get how you're doing that. Please make that explicit. And then I got half of a page of integral substitutions, etc. And if I read that piece of text just on paper, I would say, okay, this is symbolic notation. Now, solving that integral, coming up with it, happens both in the case of Claude up in the cloud, and if I had been doing the same thing, and I just barely think I could have done it as a human mathematician, I would have been using my brain, and we both would have been using a lot of squishy strategies to move those symbols around, kind of coming up with this kind of integral looks like that type. I should probably try a trigonometric substitution. Whatever was that about? It was ages since I learned it. And then we try it. We might then have a strategy that is biological and or symbolic and work our way through. So I do think these complicated systems that use different modes are important. I think the brain is doing that. The brain, after all, the cortex seems to be a general learning system. It's a bit like the attention mechanism in current LLMs. But you also have reinforcement learning in the basal ganglia. And there might even be some kind of model learning in the cerebellum. It's still very debated, and we still don't really know what the cerebellum is actually doing. But you use several different kinds of learning and strategizing. And then you have a business logic sitting down there in the hypothalamus and brainstem kind of setting the overall goals about maintaining the organism and moving forward in the world.
Yeah, well, I think it's really important that this discussion happens because, I mean, like, pattern matching is good up to this the moment you get counterfactuals that aren't, existing in the source material that the AI is trained off. So, I mean, if AI can do genuine reasoning, instead of just like performative reasoning based on pattern matching, then it may be able to solve complex moral problems, or do better norm selection processing. But yeah, at the moment, you've got these external modules to these LLMs that get call outs all the time. But it's interesting that it seems to be that some of these mechanisms for supporting symbolic logic is emerging within them. I wonder if we can induce more of that kind of behavior, that learning, or more of the symbolic processing within LLMs to make them more reliable and maybe even traceable,
Yeah.
reasoning tracing.
I think it's really important for mechanistic interpretability, but also taking something and turning it into symbolic also makes it public. So
Yes.
Aristotle, when he started on logic, basically what he did was taking some forms of reasoning, purifying them into a kind of abstract system that you could put on a blackboard. You could explain it to students much more easily. You can apply it more easily. You can automate it, as we did with computers much more late. And similarly, many of the understandings going on inside this network, it would be amazing if they could be turned into some clean form that could be used in other ways. Partially because we might want to distill some of the skills in neural networks so it's easier to put them into other systems, but partially because it's inspectable. We can test them. We can even find if there is some bugs in them. After all, that's what a lot of philosophy and academic research has been about, taking various domains of human activity, trying to refine what's going on there, and then either scale them up or critique them mercilessly, pointing out, look, this approach really, really fails here for these reasons. And then we can get into big quarrels about whether those reasons and those failures are bad enough to abandon that way of doing it. But that's a second thing.
Yeah, I was just thinking then, like a lot of chain of thought reasoning, that's very impressive and everything, but from what I understand, AIs can hallucinate or confabulate that. So that might even pollute its own reasoning procedure. If it's writing to this scratch pad, hallucinating some sort of compressed interpretation of what's really going on, and then using that as an input to the next round of reasoning, and validating and all that sort of stuff, that could be also pretty bad for its own reasons, for its
Oh yeah,
own reasoning.
it also feels like a very human failure mode. We do it all the time. I
Yes.
might make a beautiful project plan, but when I start a project, and then I am claiming I'm following this project plan, but I'm not, and I'm actually confusing myself and thinking that I solved a problem which I haven't solved, but and so on and so on. These kind of errors in planning, they're everywhere. And the good people at planning, of course, get over them. We come up with planning mechanisms that improve things for humans, because maybe I send in my project plan to a manager who will scrutinize it. Maybe I will have an assistant who's going to check what I'm actually doing. And we might want to improve the chain of reasoning in the AIs too. Because quite often I agree, it's mostly an pretend explanation about what's actually going on. But sometimes you can use them also as input to another AI that can study what's going on. You can build much more. The wonderful thing about AI right now is that just as we can string together human minds in our organization, we can string them together in all sorts of ways. And it's usually much cheaper. And if it fails right now, I think the costs are much more mild than if organizations fail.
Yeah, that's a good thread back into the cyborg leviathan theme, and that the idea that we can have reasoning traces happening, within silos, across silos. You can find out where the provenance was. You can track the lineage of the reasoning, and how the reasoning was processed in different departments of the leviathan, and seeing how it all tracks, as long as we can keep it in symbol space.
Yeah. And that might, of course, be the problem, because symbols might not be the most effective way of doing it. There are many people thinking that actually the latent spaces inside the system, that's where we should be doing chain of thought instead. That seems to be effective, but that's really hard to interpret for us humans.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. Okay, well, someone just asked, as a superhuman intelligence, I emulate a simulation of super AI, walk a plank mile in real SII shoes, even if you can't know all and all at the once, like a real deal, you can smell it. Yeah, that's kind of like a statement, but it's a
Yeah, but
question,
it also
maybe.
feels like something in latent space. And I think there is something interesting there. What would it be like to walk a mile in superintelligence shoes? And I think we often mistake this as, oh, yes, you're thinking a million thoughts and you're thinking super deeply. And we're taking our lines of reasoning and kind of just amplify them and add a bunch of exclamation marks. And maybe there is some truth to that. But when you compare human reasoning to a monkey or a cat, quite often we add a few extra layers that make all the difference. We humans are good at controlling our thoughts and direct them, and that's not even thinkable for a chimpanzee or a cat, that you could do that in the same way. Similarly, we have abilities to think about what other people think about us, etc. We can kind of see a few extra levels along some dimension that doesn't exist. And I do think the exercise of trying to recognize that these different cognitive dimensions that could really change the game is valuable for us, because we generally should be trying to understand the world better given our human faculties. And we also should recognize how hard it is to understand what an alien system, a powerful system or a very different one, can do. Because that also gives a kind of compassion and understanding about the problem here. I think too many people have a very naive view of robots and AI, and believe they understand them, and they're very happy to not try to understand them more. I think it's valuable to try to understand them a bit deeper and be baffled by them. I think that's valuable.
Yeah. I'm baffled when I try and think about what an ideal advisor or an observer would think. Hopefully, AI can do it better than I can. Yeah. Oh, look, yeah,
But
yeah.
there is also that fascinating question: what if an ideal advisor couldn't do better than you? Are there edges in decision space that are like that? And I think it's true. When rolling dice, yeah, the ideal advisor can't predict it much better because it's a sufficiently chaotic system. And understanding, okay, that's one edge of advice and prediction. That's really valuable. That's good to know. In future studies, it's very cool to know about what is predictable, unpredictable, chaotic, or anti-predictable, because whatever you predict, somebody is going to do their utmost to change against it. And when you roughly know which corner you're in, you actually can make better decisions.
Absolutely, and we need that. We need the epistemic humility to recognize and not be overconfident.
Yep.
Look, it's been amazing, Anders,
Yeah.
and I'm very much looking forward to the session, the panel or the discussion you have with Yosha soon. Yosha will be
Yeah.
on hopefully in a minute or so,
Yeah.
but
So I'm
you're
checking
welcome to
out.
hang out if you like.
Thank you, but I need to have a little break, and then
Yeah.
I'm back in half an hour for the session, right?
The okay, so the schedule
Or maybe
says
it's a bit more. Time is
yeah,
so
yeah.
hard.
I usually I
Oh yeah,
give
it's a
everybody a
bit
one
more.
and
Oh
a
yeah,
half hour
no, it's one
slot.
1.5. Yep, cool.
Yes.
Yep, time.
Yeah.
It's so relative.
Yes. Thanks
Great.
so much,
See you
Anders.
later.
It's been wonderful
Cheers.
chatting to you again. See you soon. Thanks, guys, for yes, for tuning in and listening in. Sorry I didn't get that question. Yeah, I didn't know to read the next line. Yeah. But anyway, that was really amazing. Anders is certainly a brilliant person. He's yeah, he knows so much about a whole heap of stuff, but he's very good at integrating his knowledge across domains as well. Yeah. Yeah, so next up off is Yosha Bark. Yeah, I haven't heard from him, but yeah, let's have a look. The one after Yosha Bark is going to be, what is it going to be? It's going to be a panel of Yosha Bark and Anders Sandberg. So you get even more like Anders Sandberg and Yosha Bark. So tune in. Oh, maybe may have to remind Yosha Bark that. Yeah, good. All right. I'm just trying to get in contact with Yosha. Yosha starts now, actually. I don't know where he is. I'm going to stop and start the live channel. Thank you. I like my shirt too. It's very Hawaiian. Yeah, it's nice and yeah, it's cheerful shirt. Yeah, I'm going to stop and start this session, so there might be a break in the live channel, but yeah, just the YouTube live link, but just yeah, join again.